For this video, I wanted to just talk about the idea of loot and the sort of logistics question within the game. So when I started building the game, obviously everything's kind of set under, like the main part of your base is set underground. So the idea is that you go out into the world, you gather loot, and you do something with it underground. And I'm really inspired. This is an artist's render, but obviously I'm inspired by the scene from Indiana Jones, the first Indiana Jones, where they take the Ark of the Covenant and they just store it somewhere. And I kind of had this feeling in my mind that I wanted this sort of scale of warehousing for the player. I know it sounds ridiculous because obviously one person is probably not going to do this. But the idea of like a vast underground bunker full of stuff that's stored is actually kind of reasonably doable. So that's what I want you to keep in mind when I'm talking about a lot of this stuff, is just the idea that I want a large kind of set of items that you can then use for some purpose. So if we quickly go to the Unreal Engine thing, I'll take you through the sort of the basic concepts of these things, right? So the first thing is we have a set of items, right? An item database. And I made this like custom editor tool set to try and like make things easy for myself. Now I've only got like a tiny little set of items here because obviously I haven't imported and rigged up all of the, like there's going to be thousands and thousands of items in this system eventually. I do have like part of the automation done, but I'm not happy with it yet, mainly because of things like the icons and stuff. It's all relatively trivial, but it annoys me enough that I'm not finished with it all yet. So you have an item database, and this is traditionally stored as like an SQL database, and I haven't done that yet, but I might end up transitioning to that. But ultimately, it doesn't really make any difference from the toolset point of view. All it is a big list of things, right? So item database, big list of things. So what we want to do is we want to be able to select which things are placed in the world, right? We want to be able to say which group of things are placed in the world and how many of them. So there's this concept of a loot pool. So a loot pool is just a subset of that item database, right? So in this particular case, you can see I've got a few different loot pools set up in my collection. So I've got a collection of loot pools. Now, the way this is set up is that you come to this tags cat thing here and you add a new tag to each item. So in this particular case, this is item category utility. So you could essentially filter for, like I'll do a filter here, item category utility, and there's only 2 items that match that. So the idea is that you've got some way using this tag system of partitioning your whole list of items. And essentially they're just ways of sort of indicating what the particular usage of an item is. So things like food have category, in this case it's plant, but like say there's food, it's got item rarity, all of that kind of stuff will eventually be kind of useful later on. So we've got an item database, we've got a set of loot pools. What we then need to do is we need to generate a selection of items inside an object relative to a set of loot pools that we want to choose. So in this particular case, I've created a collection of a thing called generators. And so the generators themselves are like a way of selecting which items to get from a loot pool or from multiple loot pools, actually. So I thought I'd talk you through the sort of setup here. We've got generators that we can add here. Generators are basically like data and code setups for like choosing from loot pools. And each one can have a different type of generation. So you could choose like, for the most part, they use like a random selection or a weighted random selection. But it can be on arbitrary complexity. And I'll show you a couple of different examples in a sec. But the idea is you select your loop pool, right? And if you wanted to just test what it would do, you can see that at random, you get like an individual generation. So I'll show you through this sub-item loot generator in a sec. And the idea is that each thing that contains loot has a loot generator associated with it, right? It's a component of it that adds things to its inventory when it starts. So you can see that these are like, they're constrained and they're sort of semi-randomized. But what I've done is I've made it so that I can run like 1 million or 10 million or whatever, however many runs to get the basic sort of probability of a particular item dropping. So I can tweak the generators to drop the rates I want. So this is the sort of thing that collects all of the different generators together. So an individual generator, let's look at the sub-item one for a start. It's essentially a tree view, a tree of generators. And the root of the tree always runs the root. And then underneath it, it's got a selection of weighted selections, like, selected generators. This all comes from studying a bunch of other people who've done like loot generation and stuff. And the idea of like a class that generates, like a class that takes things from its loot pool and generates which things have been selected, and then having ways of compositing those generators together is, I think, the best sort of most flexible way of doing it. It just takes a while to wrap your head around, how the probabilities work. So if we look at each generation, so each one of these is a generator, and they can have children, you can add a child to it and that kind of thing. And what each generator does is it has a weight of how often it gets selected. So the root generator has got a minimum maximum number of rolls. So rolls are just how many times it tests the generator, how many times it tests one of its children. So in this particular case, it's between 2 and 3 items that are going to be generated. So if we go back to that, you can see that when we run once, we've got between sort of 2 and 3 items. So each one of these children has a chance to be chosen based on its weight. So like the children with weight 1 are going to be selected most of the time. Nothing is selected none of the time, and I'll show you why nothing might be a useful thing in a sec. Uncommon is like sort of 10%. It's actually slightly less than that. So each one of these selects from one of those loot pool collection items. So you can see I just sort of did a quick sort of preview so I can see which items are possibly being selected. So I've got a generator with vegetables. These are all things with tagged vegetables at weight 1. I've got common food, which is basically the same thing, but slightly different. And then uncommon food occasionally selects either lemon or Radaway, which is a radiation supplement. So if we go back to our sub-item, this is what that generator will create, right? And so we can run it, and statistically, we can see how often these items get dropped. And you can see that eggplant, tomato, sort of like the vegetables will pretty much be sort of around the sort of 55% mark. Chopped tomato, because it's only in one of those generators, drops slightly less. And then the Radaway and lemon is a really rare selection. So you can kind of control how often a thing gets generated by just changing the weights. And if I change the weight of the non-selection, that's one way of biasing the results. All right, I can drop the number of things that get, chosen, essentially because null, like the non-selection, generates nothing. So now occasionally I'll get an empty generation. So that's basically how it all works. And to show you a bit more of a complicated one, here's one where the root generator chooses from 2 of its children, and each of those children chooses from some of its children. So, different selections can be it can be arbitrary complex, which is kind of what I'm getting at. So, and again, you can control things like if we go to the test and we go to the root, we can say, right, we could have like 8 items. You know what I mean? It's a bit silly, but let's say we run that once. So essentially, you can see that like these are all actually relatively simple. So maybe I've disabled some of these choices, but you get the idea, right? Actually, I have, yeah. So essentially, what will happen in the end is that I'll tweak a bunch of these kind of loot pools. The one thing that you don't see here is the context in which they're applied. So there's a context class that provides data about the world. So the loot pool, like these generators, can actually use that information for selection. So things like, if it's really heavily radiated, you might drop more radiation-based items or radiation mediation items, that kind of thing. But it's a usable system now. So let's have a quick look at how that kind of works in game. So in game, what I've done is I've attached a loot generator to each one of these storage objects. And all you'll need to do is there's some user interface silliness going on there, but all you'll need to do is you'll need to come to each one of these and they'll generate different contents. In this particular case, it's a rare drop of radiation, anti-radiation stuff. In this particular case, it's a vegetable. So you see the sort of loot generation happens. This is kind of almost doing a similar thing to the Ark Raiders sort of loot generation, in that it generates it at kind of map creation time. So what we call begin play. And so each time you run it, you're getting a different generation. And so each time you go out into the world, obviously the storage boxes will be not just sort of sat in a line like they are now. They'll generate their loot when they start up, which is what I wanted, right? I wanted to be able to sort of randomize the loot in the world. And we can re-roll the loot and all that kind of stuff. So essentially, you as a player will go out into the world and find different types of loot and lootable objects. You see that this one's got this rare sort of radiation thing, and this time it's actually spawned, so you can collect those. And so this is essentially the sort of core essence of a loot generation system, essentially. Now, one thing that Ark Raiders, I think, gets it wrong is that Ark Raiders themselves, like, there's nothing to do with the loot. So you remember the sort of warehouse image I was talking about? That's what I kind of want to then transform this into, right? So the idea is you go and collect the loot, but what the hell do you do with it? Well, the reality is that I want you to be able to make it into something, right? So that's the next part of this system, is the crafting it into resources, crafting it into sort of either primary resources, which I'll talk about in the next video, or just into items that you can use to build in your base. So like it's a looter builder system, essentially. And so now the loot stuff works to a point where I can actually play test it. The next part is the like crafting creation system and finishing that off to the point where you can use the loot. And I want to talk about the sort of basic resource system in the next video, because that's, I think, probably a little bit different than most games. So all of this sort of focus on world building and stuff, but ultimately a lot of it has to do with things like the reward of a looter. Looter shooters, a big part of it is the loot, right? But the loot has to have some reason to exist. It has to have some impact on your life in the game. And what Ark Raiders is is finding to its detriment is the idea that, like, once you've got the loot, you have to be able to do something useful with it. Otherwise, it becomes pointless. And so that's the builder side of things. And I want to talk about that, essentially the underground part, in the next video, hopefully. Because I think it's the biggest sort of interesting point of the game is just that juxtaposition of open world loot gathering versus the closed world loot extraction and usage kind of stuff. And we'll talk about trade systems and farming and all that other stuff as well. So there you go. Reasonable progress, I think, for this particular one. Not very photogenic, admittedly, but you'll see that it makes sense when we like do a proper play test and playthrough of it, just to sort of show you what that whole loop of loot and then build should look like. So see you in the next video.